tous et bienvenue à ce 4e épisode de l'Antichambre d'écho. Aujourd'hui, nous poursuivons la conversation sur l'énergie et on va aller un petit peu plus loin du côté de l'énergie nucléaire avec le docteur Chris Keefer, que j'ai le plaisir de recevoir. Pour que tout le monde soit bien à l'aise, je vais parler en français et Dr. Keefer va s'exprimer en anglais. Alors, avant qu'on commence, je voudrais juste présenter Dr. Keefer pour ceux qui ne le connaissent pas. Alors, le Dr. Keefer est un médecin urgentiste passionné par les enjeux climatiques et la lutte contre la pollution. Président de Canadians for Nuclear Energy, il milite activement pour l'énergie nucléaire comme solution durable et efficace. Il anime également le podcast Decouple, où il explore diverses questions énergétiques et environnementales. Alors, merci beaucoup, Dr. Keefer, d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. C'est un grand plaisir.
Virginie, ça fait plaisir, mais comme vous avez dit, mon français, je comprends tout, mais on continue en anglais.
Yeah, perfect. Alors, j'ai envoyé les questions en anglais, mais moi, je vais poser les questions en français. Alors, pour la question 1, la première question, on voudrait d'abord savoir qu'est-ce qui vous a motivé en tant que docteur à vous intéresser, à vous investir dans la cause de l'énergie nucléaire.
Yeah, it's maybe a surprising story for many. There's certainly a history on the other side of doctors being very involved in anti-nuclear organizations. One can think of Helen Caldicott, the famous Australian pediatrician, who's been a very active campaigner. What got me interested and involved? My son was born 5.5 years ago. When you have your first child, I think in particular, you start your time horizons, what you're concerned about starts to extend out a little further into the future. I'd been aware of the challenge of climate change, but reading more deeply into it became quite concerned and was looking for examples of what could be done. In Ontario, we don't get a lot of education about energy, about electricity, or our generation system. But what I discovered was, in fact, that Ontario had achieved an ultra-low carbon grid, which is, the first step of what we need in terms of decarbonization. Unlike Quebec, we have Niagara Falls. That's a good source of hydroelectricity, but we're a very big, very industrialized province. And so early on, our province started to build massive coal stations to meet the demand of our automotive sector and other manufacturing and population growth. But in the 70s, we began to build nuclear reactors instead. 3 very large stations here in Ontario, which now provide between 50 and 60% of our electricity, and in combination with hydroelectricity, give us a world-class decarbonized grid. So this was a bit of a, unexpected story, and just something that really began to fascinate me. And the more that I've dived into it, the more interesting it's become. Nuclear is an area, I think, where there's a lot of mythology, a lot of misunderstanding. And so I was somehow, like a moth to flame, drawn inwards. And I've spent my last, 4 or 5 years in my free time really exploring this issue.
Très intéressant. Merci pour la réponse. En fond, il y a un renouveau nucléaire là, qu'on sent bien dans plusieurs provinces, dans plusieurs pays, et ça s'opère partout dans le monde. D'ailleurs, même la plus récente COP, il y a été question de nucléaire, que ça serait inévitable de se tourner vers le nucléaire. Comment expliquez-vous que la présence du nucléaire continue de choquer plusieurs environnementalistes là, qui militent contre le nucléaire?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. At the most recent COP, I was in attendance, and a pledge was signed by over 20 countries to triple nuclear energy around the world. So this is a huge turnaround, particularly at these climate conferences where nuclear has been really marginalized. And we are seeing a global return in terms of certainly social and political license. The energy shock experienced by Europe with the energy war, really, of Russia cutting off the gas supplies to countries like Germany, which were heavily dependent, has really forced a reconsideration. And, in terms of that question of, why environmentalists have been opposed to nuclear, on the one hand, it's quite puzzling. We have a number of very high quality studies now looking at the life cycle emissions. So from the mine to the processing of the fuel, to the building of the power plants, to their operation. And nuclear comes out as the lowest carbon source of electricity that we have, about 4 times lower even than something like solar energy. In addition, it consumes very little land. The entire nuclear sector in Canada, again, including those mines, the power plants, the waste storage, is on a footprint of about 30 square kilometers. For reference, Pearson International Airport here in Toronto is about 20 square kilometers. So a minuscule land footprint. A nuclear plant may look like a big and hulking structure. It is, but the amount of power produced, thanks to that miraculous equation discovered by Einstein, E equals mc squared, means that very little land is required and very little material inputs are required in terms of the power plant stations and the fuel cycle itself. So you have a lot of objective reasons why I think nuclear is the ideal environmentally friendly form of electricity generation. But anti-nuclearism is really baked into the DNA of the environmental movement. That's starting to shift, certainly. And, there's a number of reasons for that. I think at its heart, the environmental narrative is one of, really a return to a romantic, idyllic past, when humanity lived in harmony with nature. And so, some of these things are just aesthetic. Small is beautiful, distributed energy. There's a nice narrative there, getting our energy from natural flows like the sun and the wind. These are beautiful narratives, and I'm quite sympathetic. I think everyone has good intentions fundamentally, but I say that environmentalists have really been scoring own goals. We have the case of Germany, where 25% of their electricity used to be provided carbon-free by nuclear energy. They shut down this entire nuclear fleet, one of the best operating nuclear fleets really in the world, and that's dramatically set back their plans to phase out coal. They have been reliant still on coal, despite $500 billion spent on a wind and solar dominant energy transition, still reliant on coal as their number one source of electricity, particularly after the cutoff of gas. And, they're in the process of building about 40 new large gas plants, 5 LNG, liquefied natural gas import terminals. So again, these are, what consist to climate own goals. So, as I said, I think this is really starting to change with a new generation of environmentalists that are, again, really concerned about climate change and looking at some of the objective facts. Going back in time, there were environmentalists who said we should be doing coal instead of nuclear, or more recently, natural gas is the transition fuel. Here in Ontario, the environmental movement was very disappointed that we phased out our coal plants with nuclear instead of natural gas. That was the transition fuel that was championed by groups like the Sierra Club as late as 2010. But I think people are starting to see that's an unacceptable transition. There's better options. And again, there's a more sort of data-driven analysis that's happening now, and a shift we're seeing in the environmental movement.
Merci. La peur des gens face au nucléaire, elle est très bien ancrée. On sait qu'il y a eu quand même des incidents notables. Cette peur est-elle justifiée?
I'd say yes and no. I mean, a nuclear accident is a dramatic, newsworthy item. It's clickbait. It's a lot like, aviation, where, there's very solid evidence. Flying is about 17 times safer than driving, per kilometer driven. But, if there's a aviation accident, it's endlessly in the news cycle. It makes for great HBO television series. In terms of the nuclear accidents that have occurred, Chernobyl is obviously one that really stands out. This was occurring within the context of a management culture of the Soviet Union with a reactor design, which we don't build anymore, that did not have containment. Even then, the proven injuries from radiation from that accident, the injuries and fatalities, are less than a single dramatic aviation accident. Now, that's not a good thing still, but in the broad analysis of the danger of energy forms, the most dangerous incident in terms of electricity generation was a dam collapse in China, which killed over 180,000 people almost instantaneously from flooding. Does that mean we should never build hydroelectric dams anymore? I think people would reject that assumption. Again, outside of the Soviet Union with reactors that have containment domes, we have the example of 3 Mile Island, where the maximum dose of radiation that a member of the public was exposed to is a little over a single chest X-ray. I'm a medical doctor. I'm the source source of the greatest amount of artificial radiation that the general public will come in touch with. I have, young parents demanding I do CT scans on their toddlers when they fall and hit their head. That's a dose of radiation that is far, far higher than what people have received, again, outside of the Soviet Union in an accident. And, I think Fukushima is really the ultimate case. This was the meltdown of 3 large gigawatt scale reactors, and it is decisive. There's not been a single death attributable to radiation from that incident. These are not, high radiation exposures outside of the power plants. So, people are afraid of radiation. I think that has a lot to do with the history of nuclear weapons and apocalyptic fears about nuclear war, and those are justified. But we're talking about a sword versus a plowshare aspect of the technology. And a really interesting story is that the most successful swords to plowshare program, I think, really in human history, is the downblending of Russian weapons grade uranium into nuclear fuel for the American nuclear reactor fleet. For 20 years, 10% of U.S. electricity was actually provided by decommissioned Russian nuclear weapons. So it's a complex story. People's fear is really understandable. I think it is fading. My dad's generation did duck and cover drills during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Very understandable why it's hard for people to sort of disentangle the weapons from the peaceful uses of the atom. But I think ultimately, with modern reactors and with safety culture outside of the Soviet Union, we have a very good track record. And certainly Canada has a sterling track record in terms of nuclear safety. And we have a very safe nuclear reactor design, which I'm sure we'll talk about later in the form of the CANDU.
Oui, bien sûr. J'aimerais vous entendre sur la question essentielle des déchets nucléaires. J'ai d'ailleurs entendu une entrevue avec Mark Nelson du groupe Radiant Energy qui disait qu'en termes de gestion des déchets, il y a une approche où on veut les enfouir, les mettre le plus loin possible du public. Et puis lui semblait prôner l'approche néerlandaise qui fait en sorte que les gens vont faire des musées avec les déchets nucléaires, que les enfants d'âge scolaire vont aller visiter, vont sentir la chaleur des déchets, vont voir à quel point dans le fond, il y a une innocuité, qu'il n'y a pas de danger. Donc, lui disait que c'était cette façon de faire qu'il faudrait mettre de l'avant pour justement prouver aux gens qu'il n'y a pas de danger dans la gestion des déchets nucléaires. Qu'est-ce que vous pensez de tout ça et quelle est l'approche canadienne par rapport à la gestion des déchets nucléaires?
Yeah, just to expand upon the Dutch model. So they have a large warehouse. The nuclear waste is buried under the floor of this building, and they use the above floor area as an art gallery. It's a great place to preserve, these excellent works of art. And, part of this is a narrative of we know how to care for things over hundreds of years. We know how to care for things as fragile and delicate as, Renaissance era paintings, oil paintings. But, this is absolutely true. When the public is left to its own imagination about nuclear waste, and that's informed by things like The Simpsons and Homer Simpson's not so safe handling of these things, they come away with a lot of fear. But when they have a chance to interact, as I have done, I've been to the Canadian nuclear waste storage facilities, and they're pretty innocuous. These are warehouses the size maybe of a Costco or large, shopping mall building with these concrete and steel casks where the nuclear waste is stored. It's in a sense, it's almost the ideal form of waste in that it is a very small volume that's created. Again, Einstein's E equals mc squared. It means, the speed of light is a big number and we're squaring that. So the amount of waste produced by this energy form is really minuscule. The amount produced by Canada and its 60, 70 years of nuclear energy would fit on one hockey rink stacked about the height of a telephone pole. It is dangerous. There's no doubt about that. Fresh out of the reactor, if you stood unshielded in front of nuclear waste, you'd get a fatal dose, within seconds to minutes. So, we need to respect this form of waste. But somehow there's this paradox where in the history of civilian nuclear power, of storing civilian nuclear waste, there's not been a single death from radiation. And that's because radiation is very easy to measure and very easy to shield. So the reactors that we use, we take the waste out of the reactor underwater. Water is an amazing shield, and we let it cool off for 4 or 5 years in a large swimming pool-like structure, and then we put it in these concrete and steel containers. After about 40 years, with something called exponential radioactive decay, the waste has lost 99.9% of its radioactivity. Now, it started very hot, so this is still a level of danger. reactor. But in about 400 years, you could hold a spent fuel bundle in your hands safely. So the penetrating radiation is gone. And you just have to not ingest the stuff at that point. So, don't make not to be too trivial about it, but, you don't want to snort it, breathe it, ingest it in that way. And so that's when we're moving from, these Costco-like warehouses to a solution like a deep geologic repository, where we bury the waste in a geologic formation, which has been stable for millions and millions of years, which does not allow water to travel through it just due to the geology of the rock. So that's the plan here in Canada. I think the industry does need to be more open. There are certain regulations in place which make it very difficult to bring in large, amounts of the public to come and interact with the waste. But I think the Netherlands, as you were mentioning, provides a very good example of that. I'll give maybe one more example. When the French general public is surveyed on their attitudes towards nuclear and whether it is a low carbon source of energy, those under the age of 35 say it is a high carbon form of energy. And that's pretty astounding, again, given that this country is 75% powered in terms of its electricity production by nuclear. The older generations know it's low carbon, so that's very interesting. Why is that? Well, before September 11th, almost every high school student toured a nuclear plant as part of their education. And unfortunately, because of the change in security culture after 9/11, that ended. And now there's, the public is not interacting with its, vital infrastructure. And unfortunately, this ignorance has spread. So, the more opportunities we can give the public, either through visiting these places or, some of the media production I've done. We have a great video if you go to our YouTube channel, which really demystifies waste and has some good footage from within the waste storage facilities, I think goes a long way to assuaging people's fears. The last thing I'll say is, it's very important not to look at one energy source under a microscope. So, there's other forms of power which produce waste, some of which we don't even think of. I'm a big fan of hydroelectricity. It plays a huge role in terms of decarbonization. But what happens to a flooded land area when you put up a dam? Well, all of the vegetation in there starts to decompose and it releases something called methylmercury, a heavy metal which never disappears. Unlike radioactive materials, it never gets more safe. And it bioaccumulates up the food chain. So, indigenous peoples, the Cree across northern Quebec, they were warned for many years, you can only consume this amount of your traditional country foods. This is an example of a large amount of waste that's created that is not contained, that bioaccumulates, that humans are exposed to. And again, the story of civilian nuclear waste, here in Canada, around the world, is that such a small volume is produced. It is a solid ceramic, and we're able to completely isolate that from the environment. So that's why I say, in a way, it's almost an ideal form of waste. Every source of electricity generation is going to produce waste. Let's not look at it, in a vacuum. Let's acknowledge that there is risk there, but that we've managed it extraordinarily well so far. And the most urgent waste problem we have is CO2. The amount of oil and coal and gas that we're burning every year. We're setting new records. So we have a lot of work to do. And I think, again, nuclear energy has a strong role in terms of avoiding that CO2 waste problem.
Merci pour cette réponse très complète. Je vais assurément partager les liens qui sont disponibles sur votre YouTube. Et d'ailleurs, vous m'apprenez quelque chose. Le Québec a beau être une puissance hydroélectrique, je n'étais pas au courant. Donc, certainement, je vais aller fouiller pour les déchets que cela produit et qui resteraient dans notre environnement. C'est quelque chose que je vais regarder attentivement. Merci. Pourriez-vous nous parler davantage des différents types de réacteurs et des technologies nucléaires? Évidemment, il y a le CANDU au Canada, mais aussi peut-être nous parler un peu des petits réacteurs modulaires qui sont all the rage, si je peux parler en anglais. Donc, juste pour nous expliquer, parce que ces concepts, comme vous l'avez dit, on n'a pas beaucoup d'éducation sur ces concepts-là, alors que c'est quand même très important que le public soit informé. Donc, si vous pouvez nous résumer brièvement, puis nous expliquer en quoi les différentes technologies differ.
Sure. So you started off mentioning the CANDU reactor. This is a very special nuclear reactor. Around the world, there are 3 reactors that have proven to be viable. 2 of them are American origin technologies and one is Canadian. We really decided to go our own way. We had an enormous investment in nuclear research. in Canada, and that's because many European scientists and the British nuclear program during the war, when the Nazis looked like they might invade or later bomb Britain into oblivion, they moved that scientific apparatus over to Canada. And alongside, very talented Canadian scientists and engineers, we decided again to go our own way and develop a reactor which guaranteed us energy security and energy sovereignty. So unlike American-style reactors, which require enriched fuel and a process called heavy forging to make these big pressure vessels in which the nuclear reaction occurs, we developed a reactor that uses heavy water, which enables us to use natural uranium, which we have in absolute abundance here in Canada, primarily in the province of Saskatchewan, but also to avoid this manufacturing process, which Canada did not and does not have the potential for. And so what this means is that we have a reactor whose economic benefit is entirely within country. It's rare in our globalized world to have a sector which recycles so much of its value within the local economy. And so, it's estimated for every dollar that we spend on a CANDU nuclear plant, we get $1.40 back in economic activity. And that's in the form of, very high quality jobs, manufacturing all of the precision parts required for a nuclear plant. That's in the nuclear fuel, which we mine, but then turn into, the big value add here is turning it into the nuclear fuel bundles, which are used. So really, really exciting reactor. And it's a reactor that was, what we call Gen 3 before its time, before anyone was talking about things like, walk-away safety. This is a reactor because we have a different, core. We modularize the core. I don't want to get too much into the details. And we have a huge amount of water around the reactor. We have days and days of cooling, even in the situation of a Fukushima-like problem in terms of a station blackout where the grid fails and there's no power on site. So really a remarkable reactor that's stood the test of time and has a flawless operational record and, most recently set the record in terms of the most productive reactor in the world. It's a Romanian CANDU reactor, which we built for them over there. In terms of SMR, so this is a bit of an imprecise term. I'd say it's a bit of a marketing term from the nuclear industry. It's a huge grab bag. So it includes things in terms of scale down to the level of a microreactor, which could power, a small town, 500 to 1,000 people. Might have a lot of use in the far north where communities are dependent on barged in diesel and heating oil, which is, very expensive and a challenge logistically. It includes larger reactors getting up to the level that would power a small city of, say, 300,000 people. So a lot of different complexity there. I think there's some underlying challenges in terms of the economics. Nuclear has always tended to scale up to the larger size that we have, say, in our CANDU reactors or those American-style reactors I was mentioning. But, when you have smaller grids, they can't take a large single source of power generation. So provinces like Saskatchewan and to a lesser extent Alberta are showing a lot of interest in small modular reactors. Currently, there is no reactor in this size that has been deployed in the West. We actually started off with reactors that were quite small and scaled up, but at present, 4 of these reactors have been planned in Ontario, and some of the site preparation has begun. But if we want to start building right now, we have a mature reactor design that's very proven in the form of the CANDU. And you guys have one of those in Quebec, which was prematurely mothballed. And maybe we'll get into this some more, but this is a huge advantage because you don't need to prepare a site. You don't need to pour all the concrete. You don't need to build all the transmission. It's sitting there. There's some work involved in recommissioning the plant, something called a refurbishment. But Quebec could have that reactor back online in 2 to 3 years. And it would be a great source of electricity, particularly given some of Quebec's woes recently in terms of the way that droughts have been impacting what seemed to be an infinite source of electricity in the form of hydroelectricity.
Mm-hmm. Oui, bien, on arrive justement au sujet du Québec. Vous vous avancez un peu, mais effectivement, on avait une manne quasi infinie d'hydroélectricité. Là, peut-être que comme d'autres provinces et comme d'autres pays dans le monde, on doit faire face à une augmentation imposés par la transition énergétique là, de la production d'électricité. Et puis, tout est sur la table, sauf le nucléaire pour l'instant. Dans le plan de 2035 à 2050, le nucléaire est exclu pour des raisons d'acceptabilité sociale. Ceci dit, à vous entendre, des lieux comme le Grand Nord, vous en avez parlé, ou comme les îles de la Madeleine, qui ont encore une centrale au charbon. Donc, les territoires qui sont un peu plus éloignés, peut-être pourraient bénéficier des SMR. Mais ceci dit, effectivement, vous avez effleuré la question de Gentilly 2, qui a été fermée dans le temps où on avait des surplus d'énergie pour des raisons politiques. Il y a eu une étude qui a montré qu'elle pouvait être démarrée. J'aimerais vous entendre sur qu'est-ce que le Québec devrait considérer là, pour la suite avec les défis énergétiques de la transition énergétique.
So there's two big factors affecting Quebec. As I was mentioning before, I mean, everyone remembers the terrible wildfire season of 2023. And why did the fires rage so badly? It was because of, really prolonged drought in northern Quebec, precisely where the hydroelectric infrastructure is. Now, remember, Quebec heats largely with electricity, which is amazing. That's a big source of emissions, really almost everywhere around the world. It's a big accomplishment. But if there's not enough water in those reservoirs, there's not heat for people living in a province that gets pretty cold. And so Quebec, for the first time perhaps, really had to hold back on some of its exports in the summer of last year because they need to make sure they'd have enough water to keep everybody warm in the winter. It sounds a bit strange, you need water to stay warm, but it makes sense when you think about it. The other factor, of course, is, every province is coming up with net zero plans, decarbonization plans. We have to remember that electricity is actually a fairly small contributor to emissions. We have issues like heating, which again, Quebec doesn't have, but transportation, I'd say, is a really big one. If we want to electrify transportation, that is a huge draw on the grid. We're also, realizing that maybe we shouldn't have offshored as much manufacturing as we did. Some of the initial impulse to, let's say, overbuild hydroelectricity in Quebec was to attract industry. So there's talk about that for geopolitical reasons and also for climate change reasons. So we have, battery plants that are coming to Quebec and subsidies to encourage that. But there's worries, will there be enough electricity? And so, this has actually forced a conversation about nuclear in Quebec. We've had, the head of Hydro-Quebec come out and visit the nuclear facilities in Ontario. I have a sense that, the planners of the system really see a role for nuclear. Around the world, nuclear and hydro are best friends. They work very, very well together. That's what we see in Ontario. Again, nuclear provides the steady baseload supply of electricity, and hydro allows us to meet these peaks. We see that in Sweden. We see that in France. Again, two other jurisdictions with ultra low emissions. So again, you have this crown jewel waiting in the form of Gentilly. This plant was up for refurbishment. Think of that as a kind of engine swap out. The CANDU reactor can be renovated, shall we say, every 30 to 40 years, meaning these stations can go 60, 80, maybe 100 years of safe operations. That was all planned. The equipment had been bought, but unfortunately there was a change of government, a change of policy, and as you said, a little bit of hubris that, we've got plenty of electricity. That station is just waiting there, a very quick way to add a significant amount of high quality electricity. We have to remember in the 70s and 80s and 90s when, the hydroelectric infrastructure of Quebec was built, it was a lot easier to get environmental permissions. And I think, the biggest challenge both then and now is, we're flooding a lot of land. The James Bay Hydro Project, it's 11,000 square kilometers of land which were inundated. To give you a comparison, that's about the size of the island of Cape Breton. So this has a big impact, and it's just a little harder to do in the 2020s than it was in the 1980s. And again, that's an environmental impact. We talked about methylmercury poisoning. There's lots of people that think that free-flowing rivers are a good thing. And actually getting back to your earlier question about environmentalists' attitudes towards nuclear energy, the Sierra Club in the 1960s was pro-nuclear. the renowned photographer Ansel Adams, who did such a beautiful job of landscape and nature photography in these iconic settings like Yosemite. That was an area that was under threat of hydroelectric development, and so they actually had a campaign called Atoms Not Dams, because they knew that nuclear energy can produce an extraordinary amount of power on a small footprint and can preserve some of our most prized natural landscapes. So there are choices to be made. I'm not saying that Quebec shouldn't do further hydroelectric development. It's been a very successful model, but again, we have to weigh costs and benefits of every source of electricity generation, and you have that low-hanging fruit. I don't want to paper over the challenges of building nuclear. We were really good at it historically. We commissioned 23 reactors in just 22 years here in Canada, so really extraordinary pace of deployment. One of the fastest additions of clean energy the world has ever seen. But it is challenging, particularly in the modern era in the Western world. We've seen a lot of plants that are under construction that are taking longer than they should, that are costing more than they should. You have a plant that is built in Quebec. It requires not an insignificant amount of work to get it back online. But again, we're talking 3 years and an investment, I think, which is very cost competitive compared to a similar amount of hydroelectricity. So, the issue, I think, is social license, and we'll probably talk more about that. But hopefully, conversations like this serve to spark other conversations and maybe a reconsideration of those long-term energy plans.
Oui, tout à fait. Et qu'en est-il de la situation dans les autres provinces canadiennes? Est-ce qu'ils font face à des défis similaires?
They do. So British Columbia, for instance, their snowpack was down 13% last year. They lost billions of dollars in export revenue, actually, as did Quebec. Quebec lost about $3 billion of revenue. Hydro-Quebec, sole shareholder is the province. That means about $2.5 billion were missing from the provincial budget this last year. We know that wind and solar are intermittent power sources. It's just an obvious truism. When the sun goes down, you don't get solar. When the wind disappears, you don't get wind. Sometimes these things coincide. Sometimes extreme weather can affect both of these power sources and essentially leave you with zero production. We are used to thinking of hydroelectricity as being dependable, reliable. But for climate change reasons, we're seeing real changes in weather patterns. And BC suffered a very similar situation as Quebec. Unfortunately, the snowpack was down even further this year in BC, and they have very ambitious climate plans in BC. They need to double or triple the size of their grid. And unfortunately, they have very poor wind and solar resources. If you've been out to Vancouver, you know that it's not so sunny there, but the mountains block a lot of wind. So there's certainly a consideration happening and a conversation. BC is a bit like Quebec. They actually have a ban on nuclear energy in BC. Again, if you have this abundance of hydroelectricity, you haven't really had to think about these questions, and it's been an easy thing to say, yeah, we're just not interested. No, thank you. But I think for very pragmatic reasons, that's being reconsidered. The prairie provinces, so Saskatchewan, Alberta, are also both looking at nuclear. Alberta has really led the country recently in renewables deployments, but are suffering frequent grid alerts. And part of that has to do with, again, wind and solar being what I'll call fair weather friends. In January, there was a major cold snap in Alberta, and due to a high pressure zone, that meant that it's pretty large wind fleet, wind fleet capable of providing electricity to 4 or 5 million homes, was producing no electricity or electricity for a few thousand homes. And so, there's an acknowledgement. They just recently phased out coal in Alberta. It was a coal to gas transition. But in their long-term energy planning, they're realizing for reasons that, fossil fuels won't be around forever, and because of climate goals, that they need other forms of secure, reliable, climate-proof, power generation. So looking at nuclear, Saskatchewan, similar, New Brunswick, Ontario, big addition of nuclear power being planned here, which will increase our capacity by another 50% of what we currently have. So I'd say, we're in a pretty healthy position, and there's a lot of provinces that are re-examining this. It's for a mix of climate and very pragmatic reasons.
Merci. Alors, même si on décidait d'aller de l'avant avec le nucléaire et qu'il y avait une acceptabilité sociale là, pour vraiment dire oui, on embrasse cette idée, est-ce qu'on pourrait se heurter à un manque de main-d'œuvre qualifiée dans ce domaine-là, étant donné qu'on a quand même mis sur pause? Je sais qu'il y a certaines facultés de génie qui n'ont plus de génie nucléaire. Est-ce qu'on pourrait se heurter à ce problème-là? Et si oui, qu'est-ce qu'on devrait faire dès maintenant pour éviter le pire?
You know, absolutely, it's a challenge. One thing I will say is that Canada is in a very good position. Quebec less so because Gentilly was mothballed, as I was saying earlier. So there has certainly been some loss of expertise there. This is I think a real strength of nuclear is that it provides incredibly good jobs in the science, technology, engineering, and math fields, in the skilled trades. The cost of nuclear energy, once the plant is built, is very low. The operating costs, the fuel is very inexpensive. Those operating costs are largely in the form of high wages paid to skilled workers. So, I mean, we want more of that. We want a just transition. We want to take, highly skilled fossil fuel workers and move them into nuclear. And I think, in the midst of a kind of gig economy where we're seeing, a real decrease in wages and job opportunities, this is a good story. But yes, it is a challenge. Now, we are in a good position here in Canada because we have a very active nuclear industry. We built, again, 23 power stations in just 22 years. And then we exported Canada reactors around the world. Our reactor was such a good technology that countries wanted to build it. So China, Korea, Romania, Argentina, India. So we've managed to keep the sector really active. Now we're doing refurbishments of our Canada reactor fleets here, and that has got a lot of skilled trades rejuvenated. That's a big concern, is that the skilled trades are aging out. So we need to make the investments. We maybe need to change some of our immigration criteria. There's been a real in terms of the way that we give points to potential immigrants. It's favored things, certain, academic accomplishments. Maybe we need to encourage more skilled trades. But I think this is a solvable problem, and ultimately, this paints a bright future because these are precisely the kind of jobs that we want.
OK, merci. Et en tant que personne qui est bien versée là, dans ce domaine, quelles sont les plus grandes idées fausses ou mythes? Vous en avez glissé un mot, là, qu'il y avait beaucoup de mythes persistants sur l'énergie nucléaire là, que vous aimeriez démystifier.
I think waste is the big one. We've certainly touched on that. The accidents are another one, and we touched on that briefly. Again, you'll hear estimates of, how many people were hurt by Chernobyl, ranging from, 1 million people died because of Chernobyl, down to less than 100. And, who do you trust? In medicine, there's been a big move towards what we call evidence-based medicine, critical appraisal, looking at the quality of studies. Everybody saw during COVID, it was really hard to get a sense of what was going on because there was really low quality research coming out, and a lot of it. And, it's interesting looking at those studies. So the study saying, 1 million people died, it was funded by Greenpeace. There was another study said 100,000 people died. It was funded by the European Green Party. These were, in the case of the Greenpeace study, it was 2 scientists. They attributed every excess death in the Soviet Union to Chernobyl in the midst of a massive economic collapse, the collapse of the Soviet Union, a huge rise in alcoholism, tuberculosis, etc. So the methodology was very weak. In the case of the European study, it was a group of 3 scientists using something called the linear no threshold model to say that very low doses that went across Europe, caused a lot of cancer. The most high quality studies, it's a UN agency, but you had the participation of 8 UN agencies, all of the affected countries. They're the ones that came up with this number of under 100 people. And so it's a much more reliable, source of information, consensus decisions, scientists fighting amongst themselves in big committees for years. And I think that's much more reliable data. So again, I mean, that's not something to celebrate. We don't want any more Chernobyls, but at the same point, we don't build reactors like Chernobyl anymore. And the safety culture within nuclear, similar to aviation, has really improved dramatically. So, I think accidents are probably another thing to demystify.
Merci. Lors de notre dernier épisode, nous recevions quelqu'un qui est venu commenter sur l'énergie et sur le mix énergétique du Québec. Et c'est sûr, il mettait beaucoup les critères économiques de l'avant en termes de coût par kilowattheure. Donc, qu'on devrait privilégier, par exemple, l'éolien si c'est 12 sous. Donc vraiment d'y aller avec une analyse purement économique sur les choix qu'on devrait faire. Est-ce que, selon vous, c'est une bonne approche et sinon, pourquoi?
So cost is definitely very important. The price of electricity, it's something that is a bit regressive because, poor households use about as much electricity as rich households because they have inefficient appliances or they don't have good insulation. So cost is absolutely important. I'd put nuclear alongside hydroelectricity as expensive upfront, high capital cost. It takes a long time to build a hydroelectric dam or a nuclear station. Once they are built, these assets end up producing the cheapest electricity. So, a catchphrase that I've used is nuclear is an expensive way to make cheap electricity, and wind and solar are a cheap way to make expensive electricity. So, in Ontario, nuclear is the second cheapest source of electricity after hydroelectric. And of course, Quebec benefits from those very cheap prices. Now, that did take a significant upfront investment. You'll hear constantly that, wind and solar are the cheapest form of electricity that exists. This is because, this is looking at it in isolation. It's true when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, there's nothing cheaper. But, electricity is a service, not a commodity. We don't go to a wind farm and, fill up a little bag full of electrons and pop them into our toaster like coins. We need that service there constantly. I compare it a lot to healthcare, where, again, we need a reliable 24/7 service. It needs to be able to meet the demands of the public, whether it's flu season or if we have a disaster. We need to have a system that's responsive. And again, when you have this sort of fair weather friend component of your electricity generation system, as we saw again in Alberta, you can make a huge investment, and the electricity is simply not there when you need it. Quebec does have the benefit of having a huge amount of hydroelectricity. It can absorb that. It can produce power when these resources aren't there. So, there are arguments for wind power in Quebec. If you want to increase the total capacity, though, and again, we're talking about doubling or tripling our grid. Wind electricity can help you hold back water so you can use it, when you need it later. But if there's weather that impacts the wind and it's not producing, then you still have the peak capacity of your hydroelectric infrastructure. You haven't added anything to it. Whereas nuclear is always going in the background and it performs. It's not a fair weather friend. And so it adds to that capacity. So if we want to double or triple our peak outputs, wind and solar aren't going to be able to do that reliably. So that's another big part. Again, cost is important, but we also have to look at other things like environment. Wind turbines, the number of wind turbines needed to replace something like Gentilly would be, because of their unreliability, they produce about 30% of their potential capacity. Nuclear does about 90%. You need to build 3 times at least the number of wind turbines. So we're looking, with 2 megawatt wind turbines, we're looking at something like 900, large wind turbines, probably all up and down the St. Lawrence. This has an impact. It has an impact on migratory birds. It has a visual impact. You have to build access roads, transport very large bits of machinery. Maybe that'd be more easy on the St. Lawrence because you can use the seaway there. But I think we have to look at this holistically. So cost is important. The land use is important. Where things are manufactured. So there have been attempts to establish renewables industries in Europe and in North America, but these industries have largely relocalized to China, for instance, which has a total dominance of the solar supply chain and an increasing dominance of the wind supply chain. So, where do we want the economic activity? Where do we want the jobs? Once you build a wind farm or a solar farm, there's lots of jobs in the construction phase. They're not particularly high skilled, particularly in solar, but they're not durable. There's no parking lot outside of a wind farm or a solar farm. So if we want, sustained long-term high quality jobs, that's a big part of the picture. And one last thing I'll say is, durability. A lot of people think, okay, once we've built enough power generation, we can sort of brush our hands and we're all done. This decarbonization, this clean energy, it's not doing it once, it's doing it forever. And nuclear and hydro provide those durable century-long assets. The average life of a wind farm is about 20 years. And so that means, you need to replace the wind farm, 3, 4, 5 times over the lifespan of that nuclear plant. So that's another thing definitely to consider. So cost important. It's big upfront capital cost, but it ends up producing low carbon electricity over the long lifespan of the asset. And that's in that way, I think hydroelectricity and nuclear are very similar.
Merci. Et puis, avec l'essor des technologies, de l'information, de l'intelligence artificielle, voyez-vous des opportunités pour améliorer la sécurité des centrales nucléaires?
So, nuclear plants are obviously already very secure. It's interesting, if you go into a nuclear plant, into the control room, everything is not digital, it's analog. There's some things that are becoming digital, but there's what we call an air gap. We don't want nuclear plants connected to the internet for obvious reasons. Where I think artificial intelligence comes in is in doing sort of analytics, is in operation, is in refurbishments. We have to process a lot of data. And we've seen dramatic improvements in these big refurbishment projects where we're, again, swapping out the reactor internals of our CANDU reactors. We've gone from, that being a 4-year process down to, 2.5, 3 years. These are one of the only mega projects in the Western world that are coming in under budget and ahead of schedule. And so there are definitely opportunities for AI, I think, in terms of that kind of data analytics. In terms of sort of squeezing out more efficiency from our nuclear plants, it's already an extraordinary story. We produce, 90 to 95% of the potential installed capacity. Again, something like wind is about 30%, solar in Canada, 14, 15%, depending on where you cite it. So, I don't think there's a ton of room in terms of operations, but, there's many opportunities, and, I'll confess I am no expert in AI, but, that's kind of, my thinking off the top of my head.
Bien, merci beaucoup. Je vois que le temps file, donc ça serait pas mal la fin de l'entrevue. Est-ce que vous auriez quelque chose que vous aimeriez ajouter? Une conclusion peut-être sur la suite des choses au Canada ou au Québec pour le nucléaire?
Yeah, again, I think we have a really remarkable history, both in Quebec's, hydroelectric build-out and in mostly Ontario's nuclear build-out. These are two forms of energy which we've done extraordinary things with in the past, and really are the backbone of our low carbon electricity. Canada's not doing too bad nationally in terms of its electricity emissions, and again, we're about 60% hydroelectric powered, 15% nuclear powered, and the rest is a mix of oil and gas, and renewables are starting to make a little dent, around the 5 or 6% range. So we have a legacy to build upon, a successful legacy. Again, you'll hear often nuclear is just too slow. We commissioned 23 large nuclear reactors in just 22 years. Yes, an individual nuclear plant can take anywhere from, the most recent CANDU reactors built in China took 4.5 years. But, typically in the West, in the heyday, we saw reactors, 6, 8 years was probably on average for Canada's fleet. And as an individual reactor, that takes a while. But the way that we built reactors historically, certainly in Ontario, we have sites that have 8 reactors on the same site. And so you'd start one, and then, 12 months later, you'd start on the second one. And so you can bring an extraordinary amount of capacity online quite quickly. That's really what we need to do into the future. So I think, as Canadians, we're constantly sort of looking elsewhere for inspiration. But, I think we have, again, a pretty extraordinary legacy to build off of. We've got to get cracking. The political license is there. I think the social license is starting to shift, a challenge, again, in these, hydroelectric provinces. But, unfortunately, climate change is starting to, pose some questions there. And it's certainly interesting talking to journalists from Quebec now, who I think are starting a really important conversation.
Oui, bien alors, merci beaucoup d'avoir pris le temps de nous recevoir. Moi, ça conclut 2 épisodes sur l'énergie. Alors, je voudrais inviter les auditeurs à aller consulter, évidemment, votre podcast, mais j'ai aussi quelques suggestions de lecture. Donc, L'équilibre énergétique de Pierre-Olivier Pinault, c'est vraiment un incontournable. Il y a un livre sur le nucléaire qui s'appelle The Green Nuclear Option de William Donnell Needham, et également une bande dessinée qui nous vient de France qui s'appelle Le Monde sans fin, qui a été écrite par Jeanne Covici. Donc, c'est vraiment du côté de la France. On sait qu'il y a une grande tradition du nucléaire. Nous, il y a un beau lien aussi Québec-France. Donc, je pense que c'est quelque chose à explorer pour les auditeurs, là, peut-être pour se familiariser avec le nucléaire. Alors, encore une fois, merci beaucoup, Monsieur Dr. Keefer, d'avoir pris le temps de nous rencontrer aujourd'hui et d'éclaircir certains concepts pour nous. Merci.
Ça fait grand plaisir.
Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.